Hi there. Welcome to today's webinar where we will be exploring insights from a comprehensive assessment of all ASRS, Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards reports captured and lodged in Q1 this year. My name is Nicholas Camper and I'm the CEO of Purpose Bureau. Today I'm joined by Terence Jeyaretnam, who is a director at Foresight, and which is an advisory firm that does a lot of ASRS reporting work with corporates across Australia. Terence is also a professor at Monash University and also sits on the Australian Assurance Standards Board as an advisor on ESG assurance or a specialist on ESG assurance. We're also joined by Anna Haynes, who is a climate transition leader. For over 20 years, she specialized across strategy, transformation, and governance. Anna was the head of climate transition at Bupa, Asia Pacific, where she led one of the first ASRS S2 reports in Australia to be lodged to ASIC. So we're very fortunate to have Anna here today to be able to share some of her experience and her reflections on the broader market. The agenda for today's session is to essentially present the key findings of what's currently an embargoed copy of a report that's released, and at the conclusion of today's session, all audience members will receive directly. For those of you that have signed up to the webinar, that'll happen just as the webinar concludes. I'll walk through the key findings of today's report and spend about 10 to 15 minutes on that. And then what we'll have is a panel discussion where we'll get some feedback from Anna and Terence, who have been able to review the report ahead of time, on some of the insights we covered today, particularly as it pertains to their experience in market and how and what that may mean, or the insights may mean for future reporters these coming periods. Thanks, Abby, on letting me know about the echo. Might just reduce a little bit of my volume in case that's the issue. If it continues to be a substantive issue, someone please let me know. So we'll have an opportunity to hear from Anna and Terence. Naomi, if you could just go to the next slide on the agenda. During the webinar, all audience members will be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature. And so we've allocated a time slot at the conclusion of the panel discussion to take questions from the audience. Once we're done, a recording of the webinar will be published on the Purpose Bureau YouTube channel after this session, and we'll also be, as I mentioned earlier, sending that link alongside the report to all audience members on today's call. So without further ado, I might just start with the key report findings, the key takeaways from our report. I'll provide a little bit of background just before jumping straight into it. Purpose Bureau, as an ESG bureau, monitors all businesses in all economies. What we've done over the course of the last 9 months is partner with Monash University alongside other research institutions to essentially build a ground-up view of all reporting companies in Australia that we believe are captured by Group 1, 2, and 3 companies. Those companies that we're monitoring are businesses that we've used a lot of cross-sectional data on to preempt when they'll be reporting. And as they're reporting, acquire those reports and access those insights so that we can provide live and updated insights throughout this year that are comprehensive, capture the trends and the insights from every single reporter, and capture the reports and insights from every single reporter so that those timely insights can be used by regulators, government stakeholders, corporates certainly, and research advisors such as universities and accounting accreditation bodies to inform how the guidance may want to evolve over the coming years. We did a report last year, towards the end of last year, profiling all these companies. We found about 1,200 businesses we expect to be in Group 1 this year. We found about 650 we expect to be in Group 2, and we found another 6,500 that may be captured by Group 3. We expect some of those numbers to evolve over time as the economy evolves, businesses merge, and businesses grow. But broadly speaking, we've been able to find a fairly confident distribution over the coming years, which gives us really good visibility of when we're going to have the most insights emerging from market. Of course, this first quarter captures businesses that report under the calendar year. So we've been collecting those reports and matching that back to our central business register this quarter. There's approximately close to 300 reports that have been submitted to ASIC. At the time of this report, just from about 2 weeks ago, there was about 240 that have been digested and run through the insights. We were constantly had our eye on the next report and the next report uploads, and we thought after looking at a lot of the data, we have a comprehensive amount of data to be able to release a report and get those insights to market as we manage this pendulum of the depth of the insights and making sure that the insights are live to market as well. So we've acquired all those reports. About 85% of companies are not ASX listed, and as such, aren't required to or fall under the requirement of coverage to report those publicly. And so the lion's share of these reports have been acquired directly from ASIC using our intelligence on which entities report and publish. The 250 reports that we've analysed as part of this report have gone through quite a comprehensive data assessment. So we get all of these data points that we can from a report and codify them as comprehensively as possible to come up with quite disaggregated insights, more than 400 underlying insights for every report. Naomi, if we just go to the next section. The report that you'll have access to after this session is quite substantive. It's a 60-page report that goes into a lot of detail across all aspects of ASRS. Where I would like to start today in terms of understanding who these reporters are in Group 1 is comparing them to our view of the overall Group 1 reporting universe that we expect to report also this year. So last year, when we released a report in September on the ownership structure and the industry distribution of companies in Group 1, we found that there were, as I mentioned, about 15 to 20% of those businesses were ASX listed, and the lion's share were not. The lion's share were, in fact, domestic unlisted businesses, so approximately 50%. On the left side, what we're doing here is just comparing that distribution in quarter 1 to the overall Group 1. So what we've found is that in this Group 1, in this first quarter Group 1 reporters of the first 240 reporters, there's a significant underrepresentation of domestic unlisted businesses. There's a substantive overrepresentation of foreign listed businesses. This is a really key insight to keep in mind as we're looking at the insights, particularly because in our last year's report, we found something that was quite a compelling insight on the level of preparedness across Group 1. And that was that foreign listed businesses, you can think of your Amazons of the world, your Googles, your Shells, were 3 times more prepared for reporting than domestic unlisted businesses. So whilst we can't be sure until a couple more quarters data comes out, you can expect that to some extent the reporters that are reporting in this quarter will have greater maturity in their reporting than companies that will report going forward, and therefore the insights that we're observing may reflect a more mature cohort of reporters. Equally, on the industry distribution side, we've got an overrepresentation of mining companies and financial and insurance services companies compared to the broader universe of cohort of Group 1. And we've got a substantively underrepresentation of professional service firms. Outside of that, most industries are reflected quite proportionally across their overall Group 1. So as a key outtake, there are quite an overrepresentation of businesses that are quite mature in their reporting program compared to the ones that haven't reported yet. And we are seeing a leaning towards mining and insurance, financial and insurance businesses. Naomi, if we just go to the next slide. Naomi, by the way, is our great facilitator behind the scenes, helping walk through the presentation. So just a real quick pit stop on what we're observing, because we do field questions from a lot of organisations around how businesses are preparing or approaching their report structure. So across all the 4 risk pillars, risk management is just from a paper real estate perspective, given or afforded less time in real estate than any of the other pillars in a report. So if a report has on average 30 pages, which is just a little bit more than what we're observing, then we'll usually see about 3 pages covering risk management. Conversely, when we look at the strategy section, it usually takes up 40% of what the report is, what we're observing in the report. On the right side, we are looking at 94% of businesses across the overall cohort have used Scope 3 transition relief, which is not unsurprising. What's interesting to me, of course, is that we've looked quite closely at ASX 200 businesses and FTSE 500 businesses globally in terms of their reporting regimes over the last couple of years, and we've seen a much higher proportion of them having done Scope 3. So, of course, just because a business is using transition relief doesn't mean they haven't conducted a whole series of measurement and inventory measurement and even potentially assurance around their Scope 3. Naomi, if we can just go to the next slide. I'll talk to each pillar now, and we'll go through them systematically, although briefly. We'll start with governance in the next slide, Naomi. So what we're seeing on the left side here is the mechanism by which the board has oversight over the climate program at organisation is largely through a sustainability working committee that usually has some sort of board-related contingent or reporting line, whether it be direct or dotted line to a board. And that's the much more popular mechanism than reporting directly to the board, but certainly being an only ELT or management-based reporting scheme. Interestingly, we saw 34% of reporters publish that they have ESG linked or climate linked remuneration. And so 34% of businesses, so it's about 1/3. Of those that do, we're seeing actually a fairly good distribution, or a high distribution, I should say, of businesses that have more than their just 5% remuneration linked. So of the 1/3 businesses that have these performance remuneration packages in place, more than 70% of them have more than 5% of the income of executives linked to climate KPIs. So much higher than we expected. However, of course, I'll caution you to keep in mind the representation of large overseas listed businesses in this portfolio. On the next slide, we'll just touch base on risk management. So on a high level, what we're observing is in aggregate about 6 risks identified by organisations. Just responding to Kate's note about having some echo, I'm going to try and reduce my volume and hope that helps in some form. We're seeing 2.6 transition risks identified on average, and we're seeing 3.6 physical risks identified on average. This was interesting because when we look at just the ASX listed cohort, we saw this trend reversed where there were more transition than physical risks. However, when we look at, thanks, Joan, when we look at a lot of organizations that are swayed towards international unlisted, foreign listed businesses, we're seeing more physical risks. So we think, or I think certainly, that the representation or overrepresentation of mining companies will really increase that average up. And that's what we may be observing in Q1. From an acute physical risk hazard, not a chronic one. The lion's share of physical risks we're seeing are across flooding, just shy of 20%. However, we are observing a fairly even distribution. So there's not one risk hazard that we're seeing overwhelmingly more than the rest. Again, that might change when we see a lot more Australian businesses report, because of course Australia might have particular leanings towards physical risks than other jurisdictions globally. In transition risks, we're seeing the lion's share of those risks captured in market and policy and legal risks, and technology and reputational risks are a much smaller proportion, collectively less than 25%. Naomi, if we just go to the second, one. Thank you. So on the strategy piece, there's a couple of insights here that are interesting that we'll cover. So initially, we're seeing 44% of reporters have a climate transition plan, which is again a little higher than what we had anticipated for the first round of reporters, and again can be driven by some of those compositional factors. In terms of what kinds of pathways are being used or mechanisms are being used as part of those climate transition pathways, the lion's share of those are employing Scope 1 and 2 reduction pathways. And a large portion have also included quantitative reduction pathways as well. Naomi, just on the second piece, on the second slide on strategy, what was interesting is as we look at organisations that have reported conducted financial quantification of the risks and opportunities, it's about half of organisations, so about 45%. Of those, the businesses that have quantified according directly to financial accounts, there's about 27%. We are seeing quite a reasonably high proportion of businesses reporting on assets vulnerable to climate and transition risk, slightly higher in physical risk than transition risk, which of course makes some sense as it is a more intuitive exercise to move from a physical risk to an asset level quantification outcome, although pretty similar. On the next slide, Naomi, for strategy. Oh, sorry, that's what I was covering on strategy for this key findings. On the targets and metrics, no, sorry, the next one on targets and metrics is good. On targets and metrics, we've got about 55% of businesses disclose at least one quantitative target across their emissions reduction target. And the lion's share of them, which is no surprise, of course, is across Scope 1. The next slide, and then 15% of them are science-based aligned validated targets. Now, again, another interesting thing is that there have been, in our estimate, a lot more science-aligned, traditionally speaking, science-aligned validated targets in the previous period in last year outside of the ASRS regime. So that tells us there may be some relitigation or correction processes that companies are undergoing in order to reassess their targets, perhaps working with SBTi more directly, or requalifying what their determination of an SBTi target is. On the next slide, we'll just touch on what we're observing from a net zero standpoint. So for organisations that have net zero targets, as you can imagine, a good portion of them have 2050 targets, so that's about 65%. There are more commonly interim targets than short-term targets. So 16% of organisations have a 2040 target, and 12% of those organisations have a 2030 target. On the next slide, Naomi, we'll just touch on assurance. So there's actually a lot of interesting assurance insights in the report. Please be sure to have a look. I thought one of the key things that many organisations are interested in is the idea of the cost of assurance and what we're observing from a scope of that as well. So I thought we'd just kind of include this here. What's missing there underneath that 20% is that about 20% of reporters have disclosed their sustainability audit fees as distinct from their financial audit fees. So, if you can think of the 240 reporters, about 40 or so have disclosed that difference. Of those, the average value cost of an assurance is $95,000 for ESG. So we're not sure whether that figure would change materially if we had greater coverage, but it is a useful indicative insight. I recall from Treasury's initial estimates a couple of years ago that they had anticipated the average assurance fee for Group 1 companies to be approximately half of that. Although, as you can imagine, with companies as wide as the size distribution of Group 1 companies, some companies will be paying much more than that, perhaps 10 times more than that, and some companies a little bit less as well. They were the key insights that I wanted to cover. I am a little bit over time, but there is just the next slide, please, Naomi. We'll just move on from assurance. And just move on from here. So we do have a bunch of other releases coming out. There'll be more frequent releases than these ones here, but using the ASRS database we've developed, there's incredibly powerful insights that we can pull where we can look at quite really great descriptive statistic-driven insights that can help corporates as they evolve and unpick their reporting program, including what we're observing from an assurance standpoint. One of the things that we observed in the assurance program, for instance, was the percentage of businesses that are getting their reports signed off by auditors that are not the same company as their financial auditors. Equally, the percentage of businesses that have that are getting their reports signed off by a different partner, even within the same company. So there's a lot of different insights that we get feedback that corporates are quite curious about, particularly across the investor landscape. In August, we'll be doing something on Scope 3 more comprehensively. We'll be doing something on scenario analysis the month thereafter, and we'll be doing one on a new state of the market in October when we can capture all companies in that quarter. We will be doing a lot more opportunistic releases in between all of these milestones, going deep on various aspects, although we do encourage all corporates across Australia to reach out to a collective in order to inquire about how the insights may yield informative views for their own reporting in their own industry and cohort. I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Terence to walk through some of the questions for Anna and then himself and also the Q&A panel a bit after.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And pleasure to be here. And as where Monash University had pleasure to be cooperating and working with you again on another fantastic research report. Hope you can hear me okay. Great. So Nick, I guess based on what you've just presented, what's the one finding from the data that you think the market is going to find most interesting?
I'm not going to speak for the market directly because we've sat about 150 different meetings with corporates, and you get quite a wide variety of bits of feedback. Sometimes corporates are purely interested in some of the critical but more administrative aspects, such as report coverage and page count. And sometimes they're interested in, the number of risks that have been quantified and some of those more technical elements as well. What I found interesting more from an analytics standpoint, Terence, that might not come through directly in the report, is this relationship between quantification and Scope 3. And so naturally, as you'd know yourself, the intention of the reporting requirement, of course, is for investors to be able to price risk. If businesses aren't quantifying their risks, then investors, that last step, even though a lot of work's being developed up until that step, that last step is really what activates the intention of the legislation and the reporting requirements. And there's quite a high correlation between what we're seeing in businesses that have conducted Scope 3 and businesses that have been able to quantify. And that makes sense because, as we know, the lion's share of organizations have quite a large Scope 3 exposure. So the relief we saw in first year for Scope 3, and we anticipated this a bit earlier on as well, appears to be a little bit of an obstacle for businesses to be able to move towards that quantification step.
Fabulous. Anna, welcome. You've spoken with a lot of companies going through ASRS process, and I've seen you at a number of sessions on ASRS. What's the conversation that keeps coming up? What are people most stressed or confused about right now, given we're right in the middle of the cycle?
Thanks, Terence. Look, I think there's two general themes that strike me as central to the challenge of implementing the standard. Firstly, there's the broad implementation challenge of working across a diverse range of functions and stakeholders to align on, firstly, the importance of the standard, the systemic changes that need to take place to meet requirements, and also what is and isn't appropriate for disclosure. And often these stakeholders and functions aren't in the habit of working together. So the stakeholder management component is complex. At the same time as managing your internal stakeholders, you need to keep connected and aligned with your third-party climate consultants and auditors, and at the same time bring the board on that journey. So it is a complex stakeholder management and change exercise, and I think that aspect is often underestimated at the beginning of the journey. And the other part is, which I'm seeing a lot, and Nick touched on it, is around the challenge of climate risk quantification and the disclosure of that work. I think, but the nature of this is it's new. It's brand new standard. It's a complex standard, and as a result, I'm seeing a lot of mixed messages and different views around the best way to approach risk quantification and what is acceptable and useful for disclosure. So I think it's really important that people prioritise their risks and opportunities according to their financial materiality thresholds, which are accepted in the business, and also to very deliberately consider and choose a quantification approach that meets the nature of the risks and the opportunities.
Anna, sorry, Terence, I wanted to ask a question of, well, yourself too, but I thought I might pick up for Anna as well with her response. You mentioned that it's quite a multi-stakeholder process, and I think everyone certainly experiences that as sustainability fast becomes an economic question, and then a financial question, and a business strategy question, and drags in all aspects of the business. To what extent do you think, or in your experience, is that the challenge to moving towards a more quantified, the quantification step? Are there more stakeholders you've got to bring in at that step than any of the others?
Yeah, look, I think the stakeholder management component to getting people comfortable with quantification is really important, but that's mainly around being aligned on your key judgments and assumptions. So you really need those in the business, the right people in the business, to agree on those assumptions and judgments in order for executives and board to be comfortable with the outcome of the quantification process. So yeah, I think that stakeholder engagement is a key ingredient to feeling comfortable with the disclosure of quantitative information.
And Terence, I know you guys do a lot of the quantification in market at the moment. Are you observing the same thing? And is is it a capability gap within organizations as some of this subject matter is quite unique, or is it another reason we're observing this, in your view?
Yeah, there's a few things going on, Nick, and there's been a few Q&A questions come through on the quantification as well, which I'll try and cover. But effectively, the data says 98% are disclosing that scenario analysis has been undertaken, but only 53% are using quantification as part of the scenario analysis. So you'll infer that the standard requires scenario analysis, so we're nearly at 100% saying they're using scenario analysis. But quantification, if only material, and it's not subject to assurance this time. So I think that they're probably the things that are holding back quantification. I've got conversations with companies where there's been quantification but not disclosure. So there's a tension between the sort of legal caution versus the sort of assurance push. I think as everything moves to limited assurance next year, we're going to see more quantification disclosed, particularly if there's material risks opportunities. But yeah, I do think 53% saying quantification does give a signal to the market for the June reporters to say, well, majority is quantifying, and therefore we probably should err on the side of the majority and quantify. So I think we'll see more and more quantification. Um, the other thing that you mentioned, Nick, in terms of Scope 3 relief, so Scope 3 relief is at 93%. A lot of the risks are also in Scope 3, and there's material risks in Scope 3. So if you're applying the Scope 3 relief and not disclosing Scope 3, you're then unable to come in and quantify that particular risk. So I think that's also holding back on the quantification.
As Anna mentioned, Terence, some of the inputs and being aligned on the input. So I didn't actually cover it in the key findings, but one of the findings in the report was that 22% of reporters apply an internal carbon price in the capital allocation decisions. What does that say about the climate? What does that say about the extent to which climate risk has moved into the financial decision making in the market? Do you think businesses are still seeing this as largely a reporting exercise?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Your internet is a little
That
bit
was, sorry,
patchy. No, that's okay.
got it.
I think I got the question. So yeah, 22% disclose there's an internal carbon price. I think the other statistic that you've got in the report is that 84% do mention whether they've considered an internal carbon price, and then 22% have disclosed a carbon price. So that says to me that boards and executives are thinking about carbon price. ICP, so internal carbon price, is basically a proxy for sustainability moving into the CFO function, into treasury and capital allocation. So that I think is a good signal. We're probably going to see more and more of that through the June report. I also think $81 median price, which is what the report says, is below where the 2030 transition pathways sit. So as that carbon price goes up, we're probably going to see more and more implementation projects push through. The other thing to bear in mind, I guess, in the Australian market is that Safeguard is also doing what an internal carbon price might do. So you've got about 200 plus facilities with a Safeguard mechanism, and therefore they have got I guess, a proxy price in what their transition pathway looks like. So all in all, I guess climate risk, the report's saying that climate risk is definitely in the governance domain. It's highlighting that 95% of boards look at it, 85% in terms of training at the board level, but it's still not quite at 22%, still not quite at the treasury function in terms of the capital starting to look at this from a transition point of view. I might go to Anna next. Anna, is there a gap between what the standard asks for and what companies feel they can credibly say? And how are people navigating that tension?
Yes, thanks, Terence. I think this brings us back to that topic of quantification and the disclosure of quantified outcomes. This does seem to be one of the core challenges of the reporting regime at this point in time. And from what I can see and what I've encountered, I think there's two factors that underlie that. Firstly, at this point in time, there isn't a standardized way for quantifying climate risks. Companies are using different anticipated scenarios. They're using different data sources and different methodologies. And this divergence in approach means at this point, we really aren't comparing apples with apples when we look at climate risks across companies. Like we found in doing our first report, we piloted two different approaches to quantification, and those two different approaches produced wildly different results. So getting confident around the quantification data and methodology is absolutely critical to having confidence around disclosing the outputs of the process. and I'm sure that will mature over time. The second aspect is once you do have confidence in the data and the methodology, climate modelling is an uncertain or an area of science that has a degree of uncertainty in the outputs. So disclosing financial figures that aren't watertight isn't something that boards and executives are necessarily comfortable with, and I think that's part of the journey. I think what's really important to address that discomfort is to have very clear assumptions and judgments, as I mentioned earlier, to have the right stakeholders standing behind those assumptions and judgments, like your finance directors, your insurance directors, that they're comfortable and they're supporting those assumptions. And also that you have the right senior stakeholders verifying the content. So by the time it gets to board, all of the right stakeholders in the business stand behind the content that is forward-looking. So I think that those two key things are really important to help boards, become comfortable disclosing forward-looking information.
Thanks, Anna.
I wanted to jump in and ask the question, Terence. Just was a little insecure about my internet connection at this stage, but I'm going to assume it's fine. So I wanted to ask Terence, obviously you're on the AU-ASB board. I wanted to ask if on the governance and strategy disclosure specifically, if you're seeing evidence that ASRS is driving internal change in how companies are thinking about climate risk, or if it's largely still a compliance or box ticking approach.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think there's a few things to mention. I mean, I think the first round of reports is telling a story around maturity and integration. So that I think means that there's going to be more effort required in the sort of short to medium term in the disclosure space. So what I'm finding with my conversations with clients and preparers is that work on implementation and other parts of sustainability, nature, and so on, has taken a backseat to climate disclosure right now. But I'm always glass half full person, so I'm sort of thinking, well, we had about 250 companies doing voluntary reporting and doing some good things from a leadership point of view, but the mandatory requirements mean that the floor's lifted across 5,000 plus companies when you look at groups 1, 2, and 3. So what we then have is a whole bunch of companies needing to measure their impact and eventually work out whether that's got a financial impact, whether that's what your transition plan is, what the metrics and targets are, what the REM that's linked to your executives are. All of that then, combined with assurance, means that we should see implementation go up because you've got disclosures to the market around what you're going to do about risk and opportunity. So to me, optimistically, the implementation effort is going to increase substantially across the economy. But at this particular point, there's a lot of effort around getting to understand the standard and producing a first report. One thing to bear in mind, I do think that companies, in my view and in my conversations, companies haven't added additional resources. This has become an extra thing that our clients have to look after, which is why we're seeing other things take a back seat. But the other thing to bear in mind is that year on year, the work effort's going to lift, right? First year, you've got your four metrics to be assured, but the whole thing to be prepared. Next year, you're going to move to everything to be assured. So the work effort's got to lift. The third year, everything's got to be assured again to limited assurance. But the year after, you're going to move to reasonable assurance. So the work effort lifts again. And then you're on reasonable assurance fourth year. Every year, you've got to lift. So if you think, well, we've done our dash on disclosures this year, no, the work effort is going to keep going up. So when do you find time for implementation? I think boards are going to ask about what's happening to this metric, what's happening to this particular target that we set, what's happening to the transition plan. And so we need additional resource and budget to be able to meet those requirements as the work effort around disclosure lifts. Integration and maturity is key. So 6.2 risks versus 1.7 opportunities tells the story around maturity. When we looked at just the listed companies, we had less risks and more opportunities, more transition risks and less physical risks. It flipped when we looked at the whole cohort. I think that's the story around the maturity of the market, understanding the transition pathways better. If you just started measuring your carbon atoms, you're not going to have insights into what you can do about the risks from a transition point of view, whereas the physical risks are obvious from insurance or from past events like ASIC's call out. So yeah, there's a number of dynamics that are at play, but I do think that the message should be that companies need to devote more budget and more resources to meet the disclosures that you've set out in your journey. I'm going to ask you a question, Nick. Looking ahead, you've talked about a number of reports coming, Q2, Q3, lodgements. Based on what you've seen from Group 1, what do you expect will shift? And we've talked a little bit to that. And what do you think will stay stubbornly the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think a large portion of what will drive different trends in the numbers we're observing now is that recorrection on the broader Group 1 universe that are not multinational listed businesses. We're going to have, I think about 400 unlisted or 500 unlisted businesses report and much less foreign listed. And we know that they're less mature, but we also know that there are certain elements the reporting regime reports on under ASRS that private unlisted businesses have never had to report on, such as what's our governance structure. There's many, billion-dollar family-run kind of businesses or half-billion-dollar family-run businesses, more in fact than, billion-dollar listed businesses. And, board meetings are sometimes held at mum and dad's kitchen table, and we've heard this from corporates, in terms of having to report on aspects they've never had to because the traditional financial ASIC financial lodgements are entirely financial and assurance related. And as well as the strategy pieces as well. So many of these organizations don't have formalized strategy structures in place. Not that they're not incredibly successful businesses, they just tend to be under less formal structures. And so I think some of these elements, I kind of expect similar numbers on emissions, not even that dissimilar numbers on targets, but I think some of the strategy, risk management and governance elements will see a bit of a flip on. Can I just say, I think one of the things we built this whole program to try and have really comprehensive insights and get it to market as quick as possible. And the idea is for us to use those insights to evolve the guidance and sharpen the advocacy around it. What I'm starting to learn, I think, is whilst it's really critical to have those insights as they're coming through, not to draw too many conclusions around what that means or how it will look, because we are seeing different batches of reporters, and we will see them substantively in quarter 3 this year, calendar year, where 70% of reporters will lodge. But I think we're also seeing such a fast pace of technology development. Go back 3 years ago, the idea of a scope 1 and 2 software was, pretty ubiquitous. Then there's scope 3, and then there's data that goes into it. We operate quite universally in that space. Now there's climate risk applications, and then there's more accessible climate risk applications available. And the role of the consultants evolving quite rapidly as well, where they can focus on very specialized areas as well. And so I think reporting, whilst to your point earlier, Terence, the bar is lifted and there's more work that needs to be done. I think some of the bits that you've done before, if the appropriate investment in your data technology and advisory kind of composition evolves, some of those elements should get easier. And so I think about that in terms of the future insights, because I think assurance should hopefully be controlled a little bit more in terms of the extent and how invasive it can be, and a variety of other aspects as well. That's my 2 bit.
Amazing. Thanks, Nick. I'm just going to go to audience questions, and Anna, I'll come to you shortly. I'm just going to give you a minute to prepare for this question around ASIC feedback and whether that's changed the view on preparers going forward. But I've got a question from Yesh. Hi, Yesh. Good to have you on the program. Can you provide some detail of those examples where financial impacts were integrated into financial accounts? What were the crows? Where in the accounts were they integrated and how were they integrated? There's a bit more detail to this, Yesh, in the report, but I'll have a crack and Nick might have a go as well. But essentially, we found that 29% of disclosures had some linkage to the general purpose financial statements. There's more detail, and what I'm going to quickly switch to, Nick, is to ask you now, this report, which is about 50 pages, is only about 20% of the data that we've looked at collectively. I know you're looking at additional reports coming and so on, but I know you're also looking at how to make the data accessible to preparers so that they can use this information in how they look at um, risks and opportunities through to how, what they disclose and how far they go. Can you provide some insight into what you're doing in that space?
Yeah, so this, as with everything, is kind of started as a kernel and has been evolving quite rapidly because as we've been building the database and the intelligence, there's so many applications we're observing well beyond just helping inform some guidance based on some descriptive statistics. And so one of the things we're learning is there's, of course, the government policy prerogative. So we can start doing things like really assessing. This is the first time we'll have uniform business emissions across most of the economy all in one accounting under one accounting universal accounting framework. 95% of business emissions will be captured by Group 1 by our modeling. And this first quarter, we have about a quarter of those emissions in the economy. But in addition to that, we can layer on these targets and understand, okay, where in the economy are these reductions occurring, and how does that compare to government policy? Is the Australian government is the current reduction pathway more or less than what we're seeing in some aspects of the business community? And I think within that, we're trying to better understand industries particularly. And so this is what we will be looking at, trying to do some more industry-based engagement, working with some associations and the like. But of course, so a lot of climate risk is quite a lot of industry, has quite a lot of industry nuance. So we have developed a kind of industry benchmarking kind of tool. Still working through how corporates might get access to that. But what we're also thinking about is the next step, which is when you start to look at your climate risk in your value chain, for instance. A lot of organizations might be doing, less or more sophisticated inherent risk views. We trade with a particular segment, we trade with a particular geography. But we can actually begin to move towards a residual risk view, where we can ask the question, which of your business customers, which of your business suppliers have already identified the risks you've identified, and how many of them have transition plans in place, so that you can end up with a much more appropriate risk distribution curve and say, okay, we actually don't need to be investing resources with these suppliers or these customers. It's the other section. So you see a lot of applications evolving, and we're working on them quite rapidly alongside some industry association partners. But organizations, we're encouraging them to reach out so that we can help inform how we best invest our next product development, in this research in order to put it out that has the most impact.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Just to reiterate what Nick just said, Monash and Purpose Bureau, we're both available to meet with you and go through some industry insights individually. So drop us a line post getting the report once this webinar is done. And I'm just going to you in terms of Keith's question. Hi, Keith. Has the initial ASIC feedback changed the focus of discussion conversation in the next round of Group 1 reporters? I've put on my LinkedIn feed and the Foresight LinkedIn feed an ASIC disclosure deck and ASIC commentary and disclosures. And there are 6 sort of areas ASIC's touched on. What I've tried to do is give some practical examples as to, well, what's ASIC telling you not to do? Here are some pitfall areas. So have a look at that. But essentially, Anna, what are your thoughts from a corporate point of view? Is this going to shift the dial a bit?
I think it's a great question. I'm not aware at this point of how those observations are changing the way people are thinking of it. I think it's a little bit early. And I think as to what you mentioned earlier, Terence, the scope of assurance, is changing from year one to year two. So for those who've already released reports, I think their current preoccupation is around scope three. So that's really where the attention is, I think, for the next round of reporting for that early group. But in terms of how they take on this feedback, yeah, I can't really comment, but I'll be really interested to see the bearing that has on the next round of reports as well.
Um, I've got a question, Nick, from Ruth Madden. So essentially, does the research indicate that organizations are moving away from setting, disclosing net zero targets?
I was just answering another person's question on the chat about that. Yeah, we are. And by the way, hi, Ruth. We are observing that. So we haven't released this research, but of course, as kind of Purpose Bureau's business as usual function, we've been tracking reports for all companies before this, not just listed businesses, but unlisted certifications, a variety of things. We're seeing a massive drawback on two things. One is net zero commitments. So if you grab, for instance, the ASX 200 last year or the year before, you were actually seeing like 75% plus have some sort of emissions reduction targets. It's not the same cohort, but if you see group one in this quarter, we saw 55%, but within that, much less tapered back in terms of specific types and not quite as broad. So we're seeing that. We're seeing scope three. Now, look, I think as organizations are going through this process, there's obviously much more assurance. There's obviously much more accountability from a director standpoint. So numbers are getting scrutinized more. So it is no surprise we're seeing a drawback on scope three. But we looked at the ASX 200 and, about 90% have done some sort of emissions disclosures and about 60 to 70% have done some sort of scope three last year. That's dropped. 5% are doing scope three for this quarter. And because we've got a large foreign listed contingent, these are organizations that are quite mature. So we're absolutely seeing a massive drawback on some of that as businesses are taking a cautious approach. I can't speak to some of the other elements because there tends to be less data density. Less businesses have done a comprehensive climate risk work compared to last year. But you'd know yourself, Terence, and then Anna, all the work you've done in previous years, there's certainly a re-litigation of it that's going on and a bit more cautious as to the inputs.
Thanks, Nick. There's a lot of questions coming through, and some of them I think are worth taking up individually because we just won't have a chance to get through these questions. I was just going to talk to the ASIC disclosure. So ASIC's basically the 6 things that they've talked about. One, disclaimers need to meet statutory standards. So make sure that they're meeting statutory standards and no woolly sort of disclosures. Past events need to be considered in assessing your risks. So make sure that if you've disclosed a past event, you've got to consider that. Clearly explain and link judgments that you're making. Do not obscure material information through voluntary reporting and so on. 5th, reference needs to be precise. For example, don't reference a sustainability report that you did 2 years ago if that's not part of the ASIC submission. And regulatory targets count as climate targets. So if you've got a safeguard or some other target, state or federal government, that needs to be included in your targets and metrics. And the other observation I had in targets and metrics is that we're seeing more physical risks than transition risks in the first cohort, but the targets and metrics are all transition targets and metrics. So there's a misalignment between the risks and how organizations are saying they're managing the risks. So that's another tip that ASIC will no doubt pick up next time. Nick, I might come to you to close out and talk about next steps.
Great. Thanks, Terence. I was just rapidly trying to answer as many questions on the chat as possible to try and resolve some of them. Yeah, so I mean, what we've done with this coalition, we called it ASRS IP formally, where a lot of research institutions, accreditation bodies, and the like have formed a coalition to access a central source of truth on ASRS data. The challenge, of course, is that the lion's share of these reports are not publicly available. And so to get real critical dense and mass in order to inform these insights, you need access to all of those. And so we've set up the collective to be able to sponsor a lot of that data infrastructure work, cost acquisition, and so on, in order to maintain that live database. We have built this quite powerful portal that many of these organizations are now accessing for research. And we plan to continue to do as frequent research as possible. Where we think that some of this is really powerful, as I mentioned earlier, is this industry-based piece. So, for instance, there really isn't one main listed construction business that reported in Group 1, Quarter 1, but they're all August onwards. And so if you're an unlisted construction business or even listed, you haven't really got much of a reference point from earlier in the year unless you've got access to the unlisted businesses. And so that, and for many other reasons, the industry-based insights are really critical. And so there's so much to get out. We really are going to be trying to lean on some industry association bodies to be able to use that as the opportunity to cut up certain industry-based data and distribute that. So if you are a part of an industry body and you're engaged, please reach out to them. Please feel free to introduce them to us. We've got many we're collaborating with, and it's keeping us very busy, but it's the best signal to us on where we can have the greatest impact. So please send that through. We are inviting organizations similarly to reach out, and we'll be reaching out so that we can continue to understand how they're consuming the insights as part of this program. So we'll continue to be reaching out on account of that as well. I do want to thank you, Terence and Anna, for joining today's panel. Anna was the first report, did one of the first reports, only because we're not completely sure if it was the first report, but we think it was, with a very unusual year end of 28 December, I think, if that's right, Anna.
Yes, it was one of the first. Yep.
So, and I think one of the great things about having Anna on board, of course, is she's got quite a broad set of skill set across strategy over many years as well. And I think that's something we're certainly observing, as it's quite a multi-stakeholder process, that having purely sustainability expertise isn't just enough to get this whole thing done, and everyone would know that. I don't think that's a controversial view. You need finance. You need procurement, you need many different functions. So as this is a team effort to get reporting done, it's really critical to have perspectives, particularly from people like Anna. So thank you very much, Anna. And thank you again, Terence, for the opportunity to collaborate on this research. No doubt we'll be doing much more going forward.
Thanks, Nick and Terence.
I'm certainly missing something I'm supposed to say on the close up, but feel free to reach out. There will be a recording on the YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and we will send out that report link. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.